The 1970s saw one-pot cooking sweep across the US, fast becoming the hottest trend for American households. I mean, who wouldn't want to just kick back on the couch, letting dinner practically make itself? No more delay. Let's get going. One of the oldest one-pot meals you can find in this entire national culinary transition is Boston baked beans. They're known for being from there because Boston was a major player in the rum trade. And that comes into play because it meant that Boston had an ample supply of molasses all the time. This is what was used in the baked beans instead of the colonial-era recipe, which involved maple syrup. Some local takes on the dish even had people mixing it in with different sauces like Worcestershire and barbecue sauce, but that's not where all the magic is. I'm telling you, slow cooking in one pot is a whole other ball game. It's because it really lets the beans soak up every single ingredient, every note, aftertaste, hints of flavor profiles. All of that goes firmly into the beans, and you end up with one really rich pot of food. Not a bad deal, right? Plus, with these, you don't even have to waste time watching them simmer. Dr. Pepper pulled work is something that comes right out of the aces of Southern barbecue traditions. You'll find vintage cookbooks calling for the use of a smoker, but the one-pot version makes it all way more convenient for you. All you need is a slow cooker Dr. Pepper and a great cut of pork you can trust with a blind eye, and then you're set. Usually people use Dutch ovens, but a lot of commercial slow cookers became very affordable and easily available. The best advantage of this way of cooking was that you could prepare a variety of other things like sides and desserts while this was cooked, as it didn't need any attention from you. The pork would caramelize without any worries, and the acidity from the soda would help make it an even more tender meal. Apricot chicken probably came from the Middle East, and to be honest, you'll see a lot of dishes that are going to be from other cuisines and cultures. It's because around the same time the slow cooker was born, there was this desire that enveloped the masses, which steered them away from the sausages, bacon breakfasts, and hash browns that America already offered. They wanted to see what was there in other countries, what their streets smelled like, and what kind of food you could find there. Apricot chicken stew is a good example of the kind of flavors you can expect out of a Middle Eastern joint, with tangy and savory focuses being the star of the show. The one-pot method really helps break down the apricot and provide that tanginess, along with a rich sweetness that brings all of it together. It's an incredible way to have your chicken, and if you're on a bulk diet, this is way tastier than grilled fillets over rice. One-pan sausage pasta is a name you would never have heard just a few decades before, but now it brings together the best of Italian comfort cooking and American convenience culture to make one incredibly satisfying dish. We've all been there, right? Days where pasta could cure us, but the effort seems way too much for the amount of gas we have left in the tank? That's when recipes like these come in handy. All of the pasta and meat cooked together, so the noodles don't ever feel disproportionately flavored. Every strand of noodle is infused with the taste of the sausage. The slow cooking really helps break down the fats, and what you get is something that tastes way more dense flavor-wise than anything else. Slumgullion was a kind of American goulash, which was usually considered something that was conceived as a result of the needs of the Depression era. That's because it didn't really have a set stack of ingredients you needed to get, but rather, it would just use whatever was on hand. Usually that was stuff like basic vegetables and maybe some seasonings, but in the one-pot era, most people's pantries typically had ground beef, pasta, tomatoes, mushrooms, and other kinds of great savory stuff. You know, the kind of ingredients you could throw into a pot and make one lovely goulash out of. This dish really is a lot more practical than it is useful. But when most people try to make the best use out of their food, they often end up sacrificing flavor. You don't have to worry about that here at all, because this dish has it all thanks to the slow cooking. It's a stew like no other, and it comes on a serious budget. Mulligan stew is a dish that's often associated with lower-class cooking, and it was even something that homeless people relied on to get by the week. It can be best described as a makeshift meal, though if I were being fully real with you, it was just the best you could make out of whatever scraps you had. What I couldn't tell you is how nice this actually ended up being, and the invention of the slow cooker meant that it took a lot less time to make. You could make it with potatoes, vegetables, or even dumplings, and it has evolved from a meal that you'd usually associate with horrible times and poverty to a staple of home-cooked one-pot meals. Working and middle-class families often resort to this when they want to take care of everyone's appetite in one go, and man, it really works. Navy bean soup, as the name implies, is one right out of the cookbooks of the military. See, all those soldiers get so awfully tired from traveling to other countries all of the time, they end up needing soups filled with ham and cured pork to put some pep in their step. Navy bean soup was particularly nice for two reasons. It was already cheap, which was kind of the theme of the time with the World Wars. But even after that, the habit of rationing and using cheap ingredients for military ventures didn't really go away. Anything that cuts costs, right? Navy bean soup definitely knew how to save money. And once slow cookers became a thing, it was saving time too. The second reason is that it was pretty easy to make wherever you were, and it was easy to carry around too, in pots or a thermos. This meant that it was the perfect military food. Healthy, easy to make in bulk, and easy to carry around. Don't think it takes a genius to figure out why they abused this recipe to the moon and back. Pork and sauerkraut are things that come right out of German-American communities. Put this in a pot and leave it to cook, and let the fragrance carry you right to the streets of Munich and Prague, where New Year's celebrations meant that everyone had an incredible amount of pork and sauerkraut available all the time. It's definitely a historical middle-class dish associated with the late 1900s, and the slow cooking meant that even really tough cuts of pork could become tender, soft, melt-in-your-mouth slices of pork that got anyone's appetite going. When people were exploring foods from other countries, Pennsylvania in particular took a big interest in German food. Maybe because it had its fair share of German-American communities, or maybe because it was just that good. But either way, if you wanted to take an express tour into what German eating felt like, you would go on over to the Midwest or Pennsylvania to try this. On the other end of the spectrum, we have something brazenly American, with something with a lot of influences from spicy recipes popular in Mexican cooking. I was expecting something that would set you on fire like you were, but tamale pies are actually pretty neat in that regard. They're kind of like a build-your-own burger because you can adjust a lot of things about this to create your own tamale pie specific to your tastes. Basically, there's no universal standard, no golden rule of thumb you need to follow here. That's probably why it became such a well-loved middle-class dish, because it meant that people could easily tweak the recipe however they needed according to whatever was there in the pantry. Hey, sometimes it's the last of the month and you just don't have a lot of oomph going on in your pantry. Sometimes you get a slight bonus and you decide to get that better, premium cut of meat. Both times can be a tamale pie night if you're down. You couldn't say that before the slow cooker because it meant that you'd have to spend a lot of your day babysitting the dish, but now, the dish just makes itself really. If you want a tame introduction to Mexican food, tamale pies might be a good place to start, or if you just like tomato sauce-based pies with chili seasonings and cornmeal. I'll forgive you for thinking this is another showcase of how we tried to copy other countries' culinary mojo, because Swiss steak does sound pretty well Swiss. What might raise your eyebrow is that this is actually a purely American dish. It involved braising, which is a kind of slow cooking that tenderizes any cut of meat to the maximum, and this one involved a round steak in a tomato-based sauce with bell peppers. It was a pretty big classic in the 30s and 40s. Whenever people could afford to get some cuts of meat, they were usually cheap, and as a result, they were more than likely to be tough ones. A dish like this that could take even rubber disguised as beef and turn it into a buttery, smooth steak was a godsend in those times. The fact that it didn't need a lot of work on the side to make it shine also meant that it was something the populace could really jibe with, and slow cooker meant that you could braise away without worry. It wasn't one of the most popular steaks ever, and of course, if you were working with recipes that were centered around making better cuts of meat shine, you'd probably get a more decent steak experience, but it was a homely meal to have after a tough shift or a day spent taking care of the kids. Can anyone ask for more relief? Especially when cooking, it became a non-issue later on. As a country, we can thank Texas for a lot of things. Tex-Mex cuisine, an infinite supply of memes thanks to country music, rodeos, some of the nicest BBQ sauces you'll ever have, and a guaranteed chuckle every time you have to speak to a redneck Republican. If you want to keep adding to the list, a good chili con carne is something that'll make you even more thankful the state exists and has developed into the savory jackpot it is. The dish pretty much means chili with meat, and it's a wonderful blend of beef, chilies, and spices with roots in the Mexican borderlands. It's somewhat become a symbol of Texas cooking too, which is known for not being easy on your stomach at all. This dish is no different because it takes cubed beef, chili peppers, and beans, plus some canned tomatoes, and puts them in a slow cooker. The one-pot way of cooking it was kind of considered a massive game changer because, while yes, you could just leave it to cook now, it meant that you didn't have to stir the chili constantly. The thing with chili con carne is that unless you did that stirring, you really wouldn't get the same bang for your buck. Inexpensive, popular in chili parlors, and very good with a cold beer, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out how this dish has all the elements it needs to succeed in middle-class Texas. As far as the chili craze goes, when America did go through phases of wanting spicier food, a lot of states besides Texas would go back to this southern classic. Some say this dish is also a Native American classic because if you go to the Southwest, you'll find remnants of old tribes, like the Pueblo, who still make variants of this dish. Theirs are even more traditional, with the recipes largely unchanged since pre-colonial European times. Chili con carne is a wonderful melting pot of indigenous, Mexican, and Spanish that takes full advantage of the different backgrounds that are present in American cooking. Let's go on over to Creole cuisine. Want to know a hot spot for that kind of cooking back in the 1970s? It was shrimp Creole, which had hints of several other styles of cooking. You could have something with French, Spanish, and African influences all in one bite. That's a pretty vast variety of flavors, so let's break down what shrimp Creole had out of all of that. You have your basics like bell peppers, onions, and celery, but it also had canned tomatoes for a no-fuss sauce that really soaked in all of the aromatics and gave the shrimp a pretty unique flair. You could make this dish for around $2.80 back then, because per lb of shrimp usually cost you around $1.50 or $2 back then. That's a pretty bare minimum price, but let's say you were cooking for a family of 4. You would have been good in, like, $10 or $15 maximum. The whole mix of onions, celery, and peppers was actually considered a trinity in Cajun and Creole cooking. Shrimp Creole also made a lot of use of thyme, parsley, okra, and garlic as well, so you could really mix and match and see what worked best for you. Not everyone liked the traditional versions of the dish, and I can't blame them because it's meant for people who grew up having a completely different palate than ours. All the same, this dish, which is traditionally served over rice, was considered one of the greatest hits of the cuisine. Cajun and Creole in general had found a pretty nice home for themselves in places like New Orleans and Louisiana. Restaurants like Antoine's and Tujag's in the 19th century were establishing a solid Creole cooking scene, and by the 20th century, cookbooks had already featured shrimp Creole as a solid dish you could rely on whenever you needed more seafood in your diet. Cabbage rolls are right out of Eastern Europe. They're the perfect thing to have at a salad bar or a low-key party where you're not trying to rack up the calories. A lot of food that's meant to be for events bloats you badly and leaves you feeling sluggish and lazy throughout the day. It's good to have dishes like these to help balance things out. Cabbage rolls are made out of ground meat and rice, which is then seasoned in cabbage leaves, which by themselves have a really nice crunch. This dish is something we can thank immigrants for, specifically Polish ones. They brought it back with them when they first came over to America, and when the citizens noticed how budget and gut health friendly the dish was, they couldn't resist adopting it for themselves. Then again, so much of American culture is imported from other places after all. One-pot culture is something we can somewhat say is our own, and it really shined with cabbage rolls because it meant that the cabbage could soften but not run a risk of burning. Price-wise, this was down to about $2–3 for a family-sized batch, which is a pretty good bargain. In Spain, Ropa Vieja is a nostalgic dish, though it doesn't have the same long-standing popularity in America. If you go to Spanish communities here, you'll definitely find a similar sentiment in people's hearts, but you'll also find some of the most eye-popping plates of food you'll ever see. Don't even get me started on the tastes, because this takes the basics of Cajun cooking and makes it as explosive as we know Spanish cooking to be in terms of flavor. Cuban immigrants are again who we can thank for introducing this to us in the first place, since they were the ones that made Spanish cuisine pop off in Florida and its cooking scene. It's a comfort food of the decade, definitely. And the most popular one for Ropa Vieja was arguably the 1970s. That's because it was never again as accessible as it was back then when people got the slow cooker. They were excited to try out all these dishes that previously they just didn't have access to. It's kind of like when you get a new car and you just can't wait to take it for a test run. Cuban-American households were already using this dish heavily, but Ropa Vieja meant that now, the broader Caucasian audience could finally bask in a masterclass of flavors, spices, and seasonings too, after so long. Aros Compo is a treasured dish rooted in Spanish culture, delighting taste buds and gracing dinner tables for countless generations. More than just a meal, Aros Compo brings warmth, comfort, and nostalgia with every bite. It embodies the simple pleasures that food can bring, comfort found not in someone's shoulder or at the bottom of a bottle, but in something as humble as rice. When topped with tender, perfectly seasoned chicken, this dish has a way of grounding you, reminding you of life's small, genuine joys. It's for those who find solace in food, in the gathering of loved ones, and in flavors that speak of tradition. Aros con pollo is an invitation to relax, indulge, and reconnect. If that resonates, then this dish was always meant for you, promising satisfaction, warmth, and the perfect blend of flavor in every bite. Cities like Miami and New York were some of the first places where Caribbean culture touched down and made a name for itself. In terms of the middle class, it was a pretty economic and practical dish. You had all your health-related needs covered, and it didn't cost much at all, with an entire family meal costing maybe $4 or $5. Even less, actually, since one of the key highlights of this dish was its ability to turn a bit of chicken into a show stealer. A lot of dishes make ample use of protein and meat, but they often don't optimize each lb of beef or chicken in there, so you get a lot of bites that feel extra gamey or chewy and don't have enough flavor. That's not something you have to worry about with arroz con pollo, and that's why it's still a pretty popular dish even today, especially now that slow cookers are in an entirely different league than what they used to be when they were first introduced to the general public. Cowboy stew is a really romantic dish. It's something right out of the actual American West, and cowboys did genuinely make this dish so much they forever stuck the label onto it too. What is it? It's a stew. A cowboy stew. What does that really mean, though? Well, as is pretty characteristic of cowboys and their lifestyle, it means going with the flow and using whatever you have next to you to the best of your ability. Cowboy stew wasn't something that only cowboys ate back then, though. It was a substantial meal even for churches. Know why? Because it took almost nothing to make it, and the dish had this rustic, make-do charm to it that really put you in what the kids today would call the grind set. Why would a dish do that? Picture yourself in their shoes. You're a middle-class worker in the 1960s, and things are getting rough with money again. It's not like financial security is a year-round, 24/7 concept, right? You use what you can because tomorrow you know you have to go back to work. You get a bare-bones stew that pulls together some respectable flavor for the amount of ingredients and the quality it's working with, and it kind of brightens your day, puts some energy back into you, and lets you go tackle on another shift. It caught on, really. Chicken bogs, on the other hand, are something you would usually get in the low-country region of South Carolina. It would blend chicken and sausage, which made for a really smoky protein element in the dish, but the reason they called it chicken bog was because the bog here was actually this really thick, soupy stew. It was much thicker than your average soup or stew, but it felt almost gravy-like. That's what made it work so well with rice, and as a result, this dish fed many middle-class families for a long time and did a pretty good job at it. By tradition, it was meant to be made with a stovetop, but thanks to one-pot cooking culture, you could let the broth absorb all the flavors and really amplify that smokiness from the sausage, parting it onto the rice. You'd end up getting 3 flavors overall. Fish chowder, on the other hand, is definitely a New England classic. It has its roots in 18th century culture, which was heavily dominated by stews, and they used to whip up a storm in the kitchen trying all kinds of crazy, wacky, wahoo fish combinations Americans wouldn't even dream of. It was all affordable too, since a lot of cooking in both America and the United Kingdom was aimed at the common man back then. You know, before a quarter-piece fried chicken meal costs like as much as a date for two people. Anyway, in coastal cities in America, fish chowder popped off for obvious reasons. You had your catches of the day, and you had a dish that could more or less work with any of them. Plus, it's not like any fishing-heavy spot was lacking cod of haddock, which is pretty much what was used all the time for fish chowder. It wasn't as beloved before one-pot culture as it was after, and that's because if you really wanted to let the fish soak in the flavor, you'd have to pay a lot of attention to detail for a long while. Thanks to slow cooking, you could get a rich and creamy soup almost every time. Moroccan Tajine is actually a dish that comes right from the cookbooks of North Africa, despite having origins from Morocco. The fundamental makeup of this dish makes it perfect for slow cooking. It takes a tough cut of meat, like lamb, and it has a lot of vegetables, dried fruits, and spices. All of these are ingredients that you already know work best in a slow cooker because it means everything can soak up the flavors of all that's put in there. It's not like you'll have meat that tastes too weird because of the vegetables or the fruits aren't soft enough and the juices are making the vegetables taste off. No, everything ends up sharing one universal flavor singing in harmony. That's why tagine got as popular as it did in the mainstream during the tail end of the 20th century. A lot of people thought it was one of those fancy exotic dishes, but when it got to mass popularity, it became more of a traditional home-cooked meal than a fancy restaurant one. It was normal to use a traditional tagine pot before, but the slow cooker meant that you could just sit back and relax. And as we all know, America is about convenience. Italian wedding soup, on the other hand, has nothing to do with Italian weddings. Absolutely nothing. Like, there is no wedding caterer that has this on the menu, and there aren't many weddings that even call for this to be a part of the menu at all. It's just not a wedding dish. Then why the name? Well, minestra maritata means married soup, and it's some kind of popular Italian phrase. I'll never figure out Europeans, but I know they can cook sometimes, and this is one of those times. It has this amazing synchronization going on between meat and green vegetables, and some traditional recipes require you to make meatballs out of the meat and have them served with pasta or rice. It was a really popular dish in Italian-American communities, and thanks to the slow cooker, it became something that people who weren't as well versed in Italian cooking could also enjoy. Also, America really took a deep dive into healthier eating for a bit, though it wouldn't last thanks to all sorts of fast food corporations taking over. But when it was in its go-green phase, Italian wedding soup was widely consumed. It's because it had a perfect mix of protein, greens, and carbs. Parmigiana di Melanzane, as known by its Italian name, or otherwise referred to as Eggplant Parmesan, is one of those times where Sicily was just doing things right. It's one of those meatless dishes that put most casseroles to shame, and for good reason, too. It takes a lot less work, a lot less money, and half the time to make something that's several leagues above your average cut of store-bought steak. When Italians did end up bringing this dish back to America thanks to mass immigration, it was an immediate household hit. People loved eggplant dishes, but they realized that their cooking just doesn't know what to do with it. There wasn't a lot Americans ever did with eggplants except as a side to some dishes, and even then it would just be the same cooked eggplant. Nothing really new, you know? And that kind of grinds the gears of any avid foodie. Eggplant Parmesan changed that completely, especially when the one-pot version came around. It used tomato sauce, mozzarella, and sliced eggplants, which were breaded and fried and then layered. This meant that you had several textures that Americans already loved going on, like the fried crunch we've gotten so used to, all in an eggplant. Let's get to something I know you all came here for. A dish you haven't heard of before, and this one actually comes from Middle Eastern countries like Lebanon and Turkey. Lamb and spinach with bulgur wheat is an incredibly lovely dish that combines protein, fiber, and iron, and gets seasoned with typical spices you'd associate with Middle Eastern cooking like cumin and cinnamon. The big idea here is to make a dish that has some seriously warm flavors, not so much so that it would overpower the lamb itself, but enough that it would create a soft, stew-like vibe for the dish that would make it a standout recipe for home chefs looking to feed their families and fill their appetites. Bulgur is a pretty affordable variant of wheat, and the priciest thing on this list so far is probably the lamb. It costs like $1.50 per lb of lamb, so that's definitely on the pricier end of things if we talk about middle-class incomes back then, but not enough that it was completely out of the roster for your weekend dinner plans. At the end of the slow cook, the tenderized lamb would absorb the flavors of the bulgur and spinach and make a really vibrant stew. I'm not going to stop at just that because I'm pretty sure you've never heard about bone marrow chili either. I know you've definitely heard of dishes that incorporate bone marrow before, but a chili? Well, chili itself is a pretty beloved area of cooking in America, especially in Texas, where, like we discussed, chili parlors kind of blew up, but bone marrow was never really anyone's main thing. You could find it in places and in the odd dish or two, but it never had any noticeable kind of pull with crowds. It was always more of a supporting character than anything you'd consider a culinary protagonist, you know? That is, until bone marrow chili showed people what these dishes could really do. For people who love the richer and spicier side of cooking, this dish was perfect. It was a really cheap way to add flavor to the bone marrow, whereas the marrow itself would help the chili have a much more buttery consistency and an overall thicker texture. The slow cooker really arranged a perfect marriage of flavors here because I don't think anyone saw this combination coming. Plus, when marrows themselves were for $0.50 per lb, who could complain at that price? For kids that grew up on more rustic home-cooked diets, it was even popular with them. You probably aren't used to a dessert coming out of a slow cooker at all. I mean, I wouldn't blame you. This list doesn't really have desserts besides this one. Slow cooker strawberry pudding cake is definitely a name that catches your attention. I mean, I know it caught mine because how do you get this out of one pot? That's exactly what bakers in the middle of the 20th century managed to do, though. They took a slow cooker and some basic pantry ingredients to make a creamy sauce that had a very familiar texture to pudding, but not exactly, and the slow cooker let the cake bake while it absorbed the sauce. The sauce would also just thicken at the bottom, and strawberries were the perfect ingredient to give this dish both a bit more visual appeal and a fruitier vibe. It was really easy to make, and baking at home was already becoming a hobby of many chefs. The era of pudding cakes is now definitely over, but when it was in its heyday, this dish was one of the best pudding cakes you could make with a slow cooker. You know, corn had to take a real journey to Europe, but it was always native to America. It came from them through us, actually, but they decided to return the favor by giving us creamy polenta with a balsamic glaze, so I think that's a pretty fair trade. By the 17th century, Europeans had pioneered an amazing corn-based polenta already, which was doing numbers in many places in Italy. Back then, it was honestly just thought of as peasant food because of how much it relied on corn. The dish had no real identity out of it, but creamy polenta came about when people began to mix milk and cornmeal together, along with butter and cheese. Suddenly, it had a complete makeover and a whole rebrand. It looked different, tasted different, and was made differently, so for all intents and purposes, you couldn't recognize it as the same polenta we were just talking about. The last touch that was missing from the dish was the balsamic glaze, and that was especially used because it gave the dish the one flavor profile it was missing, which was a unique sweetness that would just bring everything together in a neat little bow. Creamy polenta would stay without the glaze for a really long time too, at least until the very end of the late 20th century, so a decent bit after the slow cooker had first come around. However, by then, Italian immigrants had some seriously strong roots in America's overall culture as far as cooking went, and when they did begin mixing in a balsamic glaze with the polenta, it took the dishes to heights chefs had never dreamed of before. It was also in line with how Americans were more interested in foreign cuisines because one of the first places they went to was Europe and Italy in particular. People sharpened their skills off of recreations of French and Italian dishes, and slow cooker polenta with a balsamic glaze is a perfect example of that. It's gourmet, it's convenient, and it's to die for. Amish 6-layer dinner. just like Kentucky Fried Chicken gets a lot of attention for those infamous 13 secret ingredients, this dish too only has 6 ingredients that make up all the magic. You have your onions, ground beef, carrots, tomatoes, and then a layer of seasoning and broth. You layer this up in a casserole dish, bake it until the vegetables are the definition of soft and tender, and enjoy the healthiest and tastiest casserole you've ever had. Simple does it, right? That advice has carried kings to their empires, and it'll carry you to a wonderful dinner if you take it. You don't need to pre-cook anything, as everything goes into one casserole. This dish gets the Amish association because, as you may have guessed, it got pretty popular in those communities and places with farming traditions. More people started adopting it when people had an interest in the many cuisines that different communities in America had, like the Amish and Midwestern traditions. The era where this dish got popular, the 1950s to 1970s, was a time marked by an increasing population and birth rate. People had larger families, and cheap, affordable ways to feed everyone were immediate hits with the masses. This is probably the best proof of how stress-free a crock-pot can be. When your cooking gets so simple that your dish gets called no-peak chicken because you literally don't need to even glance at it, you know you need to invest in one of these bad boys. This dish takes chicken breasts and works some real magic with them, but the real star of this show is the canned products. Canned mushrooms and soups are put into a dish with a broth, then covered with foil and baked. The rice absorbs all the liquid, and the chicken soaks in that lovely flavor. It gets really mushy in the process, and that means it's perfect for you to sink your teeth into after a long day. It got popular because it was one of those dump and bake recipes. It took nothing. You wouldn't work up a sweat making it, and everything you needed for it was available at your nearest convenience store. Casserole culture in general started skyrocketing from the 1950s to the 1980s, and this was one of the staples of that time. It's a win-win situation for everyone when your country's classics are made even easier and more accessible thanks to nifty new machines, and people definitely took as much advantage of that fact as they could. While the southern states were enjoying Tex-Mex cuisine, the northern states were all about Italian flavors, and baked ziti was a staple on the dinner table. Now, even with its Italian roots, you wouldn't typically find this one in Italy. This casserole was created by grandmas who were Italian immigrants to the States and adapted traditional pasta dishes to suit the ingredients available in their new country. Baked ziti was pretty much the long-lost cousin of lasagna, with the classic version including ziti pasta, marinara sauce, ricotta, and mozzarella cheese. The ziti pasta used in the dish was tubular and smooth, which makes it ideal for holding onto the sauce and cheese. This one was a hit at Sunday dinners and had everyone coming back for seconds. Remember when Campbell's cream of mushroom soup and canned tuna were the stars of the food aisle back in the day? Well, Grandma took those humble ingredients and spun them into her classic tuna noodle casserole. During the 1950s and 1960s, convenience foods were all the rage, and tuna noodle casserole fit the bill perfectly. It was a post-World War II creation and was whipped up in no time with ingredients already on hand. Plus, it was a classic comfort food that brought everyone together at Graham's dinner table. During the mid-20th century, tuna noodle casserole was a mainstay in American cookbooks and cooking magazines. It was often featured in advertisements and was promoted as a quick and easy dish for the busy homemaker. This one fell out of flavor, but thanks to the recent revival of noodle dishes, we might see this one back on the menu soon. In the meantime, why not dust off Grandma's old cookbooks and bring it back yourself? Corn pudding is a dish that may not have been as grand as the rest so far, but it was a simple DIY casserole that made your day. Corn pudding was made with stewed corn and thickening agents that helped give it a pudding or custard-like texture. However, it was not typically baked in a traditional casserole case. Instead, it had a custard dish that the pudding would go into and then be baked in. Now, down in the South, this was the food gospel. People just loved it all over, especially in less urban areas where corn was widely and daily consumed, particularly during times of economic uncertainty when households had to cut corners in the kitchen. Corn pudding was a cheap and easy-to-make casserole that was not too shabby. Nowadays, people like that have moved more to poaching local wildlife than taking Mother Nature's gifts, and as a result, corn pudding went extinct too. The hamburger helper casserole takes the flashiness factor and ups it to a 10 unlike corn pudding. Blurring the lines between a casserole and lasagna, this dish also blurred the lines between a simple Tuesday baking session and a literal gift of God. Consisting of pasta, hamburger patties, and a cheesy sauce layered on top, this mixture was then baked into a casserole. As you kept getting deeper into the behemoth, the more irresistible it would get. Although this dish was really high in saturated fats and calories, most doctors recommended avoiding trendy foods like these for their link to heart problems too. Hence, people took much more cautionary attitudes toward their line blurring, making hamburger helper pizzas a thing of the past. Firstly, fine dining and delectable foods are the perfect themes to start our list, and there is no better dish to represent that than chicken divan. Chicken casseroles stuffed with broccoli, cheese, and a special sauce. Not just any sauce from down the alley, this was the signature taste of the Divan Parisian restaurant, which actually invented chicken divans in New York City around the early 20s. Hence the association with fine dining, and its price matched its aesthetic. Like seriously, this thing cost you $1 and then some back then. Naturally though, everyone could not spread their bank account, so do-it-yourself, cheaper alternatives of the dish came around. For those who could get it, they would gladly shill out their wallets for something so divine though, and that is the saddest part of it all. You could not find an authentic chicken divan anywhere if you tried even in a home chef's kitchen. We're going to continue the casserole show with Alpine Chicken. This one got popular for more or less the same reasons the other two did. However, it had an extra kick that they didn't, and that was the addition of Swiss cheese. Americans will never get tired of a dish if it has a decent helping of cheese in it. So you shouldn't be too surprised that this is stuck in the minds of eaters and families like glue. Alpine chicken typically uses cream of mushroom soup and breadcrumbs or a stuffing mix layered in a dish that gets cooked until the cheese is melted. You also have your typical chicken breasts involved, but some people go for the thighs. It peaked in popularity during the post-war era when people really started looking for more ease in their cooking rather than sweating buckets after a day in the kitchen. You know how when you cook something, you rarely feel like eating it immediately? It's because cooking is a soul-sucking endeavor. It doesn't have to be, thanks to things like crock pots and recipes like Alpine Chicken, which bring the fun back in food and make sure you actually get to rest and replenish that stamina tank. Plus, this was a dish that really got the crowd singing, and that's always one you want to keep on your roster. This dish actually got popular for exactly the reasons you would think. Yes, landing your man through a happy stomach is a good way to get married by fall season. Land your man, baked beans suddenly are a tried and tested method. I mean, you don't get a moniker like that for nothing, right? These typically get served as a topping for bratwurst or hot dogs, or served as a side for a main event that lies more on the barbecue side. The beans are made with ground beef, onions, and bell peppers, so they definitely are the perfect side to any kind of savory or tangy experience. One of the best sauces to use was Texas Pete sauce, but any kind of Tabasco works. If you have hardwood smoked bacon though, that's definitely what cookbooks recommend, along with Taco Bell seasoning. As far as beans, any kind of canned beans work, but if you're looking for a specific recommendation that really encapsulates that mid-1900s flavor profile, then you should go for Bush's original baked beans. Either way, you're in for a great time with these. Try making them for a special someone on a romantic evening, and maybe you might get lucky in other ways too. If you do hear wedding bells because of this dish, know you did a great job. Now let's put the Frankenburger casseroles and chicken pot pies aside and go back to a real icon like the shepherd's pie. Your mother knows of this, her mother knows of this, her mother's dad knows of this, and his fourth cousin had this every year for family gatherings. Not an exaggeration by any means, the shepherd's pie really was just that loved across every state. Just simple meats like lamb or ground beef cooked or minced to their limit, baked and topped with mashed potatoes in a casserole. Literally, what more does a person even ask of a plate of food? Can we get much higher? Was the question on most chefs' minds, as shepherd's pie was hard to improve on, making the market highly competitive. No one had one unique standout shepherd's pie, and most were as good as each other. Of course, that meant great things for customers, but sadly, those days of privilege and good-tasting casseroles are gone now. Shepherd's pie is more a southern tradition than a statewide phenomenon now. Here is a casserole that came from Latin American cuisine and worked really well, which is the infamous Mexican egg casserole. Typically stuffed with popular Mexican spices and chilies, along with eggs baked into a dish jam packed with cheese, this meant that you had no worries. Ordering this meant you were getting twice the bang for your buck. No tastes were coming close to the area of flavors this was in, and none that tried to copy it succeeded. See, American flavors do work, but they often have a certain blandness. Spices are not as prevalent in traditional American cuisine, and dishes like these help fill that gap. Mexican egg casseroles were a common find at any Latin American diner or restaurant, perfect as takeout, a meal to enjoy on a date, or even as a treat to savor all by yourself. Nowadays, most restaurants do not commonly sell this casserole anymore, but some old-school Mexican joints may still make a mean one. This one is definitely something that did not sit well with some while it was something being served at every dinner for others. The tuna noodle casserole was a divider, a controversy raiser, if you will, and one that set people into arguments across every forum, thread, and tweet out there. Some people said that America was too stuck in the brief moments where it hit culinary gold and needed to experiment more if it wanted to recreate those highs. Others said there was no need of messing up a dish that worked fine on its own, always has, and already has 100 different versions. So what you had was something you had to ask your friends if they were okay with, or else you were ordering out. When you see it from that angle, tuna noodle casseroles could never have really lasted too long. Pork cassoulet was what you went for as far as everyday meals go if you wanted to work some pork into the weekly diet. Pork cassoulet featured pork shoulders, or sausages in particular, and some of the typical ingredients you're used to seeing with savory dishes. Tomatoes, onions, garlic, all your usual suspects. Except this time it uses white beans like Great Northern beans. The reason you ended a crock pot, particularly for this, is that it is a stew, and the pork needs to be browned. Now you can include breadcrumbs for a crunch on top, but it kind of messes with the stew-centric vibe, so people used to leave them out. As far as the flavor goes, this is all savory, and it does not hide that fact from you at all. The slow cooking really lets everything combine into one massive profile that feels like it's made up of many different flavors, instead of a lot of tastes fighting for which one gets to stand out the most. When this was popular, pork was leagues more affordable than it is today, and the fact that you could either make this into a stew or a casserole meant that a lot of families found a lot of use for it. It fit the tastes of almost every prolific area in the country, like California, the Pacific, or the South, and it did great at keeping everyone full. If we take a look at how Porcupine Meatballs made their claim to fame, then the answer is pretty easy, my friend. You take canned food, a sauce that gets simplified for everyday use, and budget-friendly, high-quality meatballs, and you have an easy winner in the eyes of the people. This dish costs nothing to make and requires the simplest of things from you. It's probably all stuff you already have in your home, to be honest. How often do we really find ourselves without any onions or rice? The sauce might be a bit tricky if you're new to it, but any canned tomato sauce would work too. All in all, it's extremely beginner-friendly. It caught on because between the casseroles, the meatloafs, and the pot roasts, people needed something different, but similar enough that it could work for them on a daily basis. What they ended up finding was porcupine meatballs, among many things, but the recipe is largely forgotten nowadays. You just don't get to see it being made much in households, probably because the prices are much higher than they used to be, and because there's been a massive rise in takeout culture on top of it all. Its golden days in the 1950s and 1970s are ancient history now. As far as everyday meals go, it gets pretty hard to outdo Candied Carrots if you're a middle-class home in the mid-1900s. As I'm sure many of you can relate to today as well, the little goblin in your brain that demands a sugar rush every other day for comfort is something humans throughout time have experienced. How did they get their fix? Well, you couldn't just get a caramel mocha frap from Starbucks like today, but you could take some carrots, boil them, and coat them in a glaze that was made from honey, maple syrup, brown sugar, and butter. Not really something that would suit the tastes of today, right? But don't knock it until you try it, because it actually did really well. Candied food was this entire niche genre of cooking back then that got popular. The whole glaze aspect was something people loved applying to every dish to see what sticks. These were a side dish that also worked for kids, so they got a lot of mileage out of family gatherings and dinner parties. But even besides that, it's still a great way to work some carrots into your diet. As far as the taste goes, they definitely hit home. It feels like any other treat you'd be eating, though when we think of candy today, we might be more used to hard and mushy textures like in hard licorice or sour candies. This was tender though, and it would melt in your mouth. Cheese and potatoes are like a match made in heaven, and Grandma's cheesy, scalloped potatoes was straight out of any cheese lover's dream. So this casserole tastes even better than it looked, and let me tell you, it looked finger-licking delicious. The term scalloped comes from the French word escalope, which originally referred to thin slices of meat. However, in the case of scalloped potatoes, it refers to the thinly sliced potatoes used in the dish. Many grandmas used old-fashioned methods to make their cheesy scalloped potatoes, including hand-slicing the potatoes thinly, layering them with love, and cooking them slowly. Some even added secret ingredients they swear by, like a dash of nutmeg, a hint of garlic, or even a sprinkle of paprika for added flavor. The best part about this one was its crispy crust, and I'm sure you remember fighting all your siblings for the bigger chunk of it. This dish wasn't only tasty, but was also practical. It was a one-pot wonder, meaning it could be cooked and served in the same dish, making cleanup a breeze. I'm sure Grandma loved that. So, squash might not be our top pick on a regular day, but Grandma's squash casserole was so irresistible that we found ourselves going back for seconds, or even thirds. This casserole was a staple in Southern cuisine and was Gram's favorite way of sneaking nutrients into our dinner. Squash is rich in vitamins A and C, potassium and fiber, making it a wholesome choice. Now, this dish was typically famous in the summer when squash was available in abundance, but you could freeze the veggie and enjoy it all year round too. Squash casserole was highly customizable, meaning Gram could tweak it by adding cooked bacon, sausage, or even fresh herbs. The secret ingredient that gave this bad boy its unique taste was a dash of hot sauce, so next time you attempt making this dish for a potluck, don't forget the key ingredient. Thank me later! Leftover turkey in the fridge? Consider it your lucky day, because that used to call for Grandma's legendary turkey noodle casserole. This casserole made mornings after Thanksgiving something to look forward to. This was the go-to recipe for using up leftover turkey and noodles after Thanksgiving or Christmas. All Grandma had to do was mix in the ingredients and add a topping made from breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even fried onions. Like most of the casseroles on this list, this was also a one-dish wonder and didn't require much labor. And you know, Gram used to be tired from making us a grand feast the night before, so this was an easy way to serve something delicious on the dining table without putting in too much effort. This was a kid-friendly meal that appealed to even the pickiest eaters. What's not to love about a creamy sauce and some noodles all drenched in cheese? The King Ranch chicken, on the bright side, was beloved by children and adults alike. There is no questioning why the dish was popular amongst people, as one of the main ingredients was tortilla chips. Now we know how liked chips are in the States. Make it part of a food item, and you have a potential fan favorite on the dinner table. It helped that making the King Ranch chicken was a quick and easy process. All you had to do was have slices of boneless chicken layered on tortilla chips, then add a layer of cheese and creamy tomato sauce. With just a few simple steps, your King Ranch chicken was ready. People presumed this casserole to be more of an appetizer snack rather than a dinner item, but that did not stop people from having their fair share of cheesy tortillas throughout dinner time. Eventually, modern nachos recipes replaced the place of King Ranch chicken on dinner tables, causing it to become a forgotten gem. You may be familiar with broccoli casseroles, but did you know that pearl onion broccoli bake was a popular variant amongst people who enjoyed broccoli but wanted more from their casserole? This scrumptious recipe uses broccoli florets and pearl onions that are cooked in a creamy sauce made using heavy whipping cream and cream cheese. Do not let the creamy cheese sauce distract you from the fact that pearl onions have numerous health benefits attached to its name, like cardiovascular health and being an antioxidant. Vegetarian families across the state welcomed the dish onto their dinner tables because of how delicious and healthy it was. Given that the recipe required only a few ingredients, the cheap nature of the recipe made it popular amongst working-class and middle-income households as well. The dish, however, never found mainstream success, which is the main reason why, as time passed, lesser tables had pearl onion broccoli bake as a main dish. So you know how America and pulled pork go together like jam on toast, right? After all, it's something you can feed a whole crowd and have them feeling full and satisfied. It's a showstopper, but you can make a lot of easy things with it. Most dishes you can make and serve will have people asking you what your recipe is, but that's just how easy pulled pork is to work with. So, when I say this next sentence, hear it with an open mind. How do you feel about cherry cola pulled pork? Yeah, slow-cooked, barbecue-y, savory pulled pork left to simmer in a pool of cherry cola, barbecue sauce, and other seasonings. The first time I heard of this dish, I struggled just to imagine all of those flavors in one bite. Like, barbecue sauce is a dip, pulled pork is a main dish, and cherry cola is a drink. You're used to having all that separately, right? Despite that, since it was all made from things that were so readily available in most homes, and since it was right up the alley of home chefs in their slow-cooking era, it took off in a major way. Especially in the South, where everything involved in this dish is something people were already having on a daily basis. Like cobbler? Then you need to hear about the wonderful blueberry ones everyone used to make in their crock pots. It isn't really a secret that cobbler is an everyday dessert in most American households, and it's been that way for longer than either you or I have been around. It'll stay that way after everyone we know is gone too. Some things are just generational like that. Blueberry cobbler used to be made in crock pots back then to really let it absorb the flavor. And since you could just leave the dessert to bask in the flavors on its own, people started making it so much more. After crock pots went mainstream and most households had one, sales for lots of berries and fruits went up because of how easy it became to make desserts surrounding them. Blueberries definitely weren't an exception, and the best part was that you could make this at any time of the year, and it would still work. Like, you know how some people don't like having hot chocolate outside of winter? You'd never get any concerns like that with a blueberry cobbler. There was always someone ready to eat a whole plate. If we take a small intermission from the dessert side of things and step on over to some hearty, comforting, and homely soups, we'll find a golden recipe lost among the cookbooks of the 20th century that don't get to see the light of day anymore. Pea and Ham Soup got its name because of how affordable it was. This is probably the cheapest thing on the list to make. Actually, it literally costs just a few cents. All you needed was ham and peas. You'd simmer them in the crock pot with diced ham and some vegetables like potatoes and celery, then slow cook it until the soup got thickened. You'd get this incredibly creamy, lovely soup that was just perfect for winter nights or after a long, exhausting weekend. Maybe you want to ease up on your stomach and eat something healthy for a change, but you still want some familiar flavors to keep you company. A soup like this would be right up your alley. It costs nothing, feels better than most things, and you can make it any time. You could probably even take a nap and wake up to the scent of the soup slowly cooking, becoming the final product. Just like its predecessor on this list, baked spaghetti casseroles did not last too long either. We remember well and clear what people's candid opinions on beef and noodles casserole was. A lot of the millennial crowd believed that it was a dish with no real sense of self. Like, if you want spaghetti, just have spaghetti. Casseroles are somewhere else on the spectrum, and maybe they were right in avoiding it without even a single try. Some people did give it a fair shot, though, and ended up liking it. But the general consensus was that spaghetti sauces do not go well with casserole dishes. Nor do they fare well when baked with cheese. Baked spaghetti casseroles kind of had a cult following, and because of that, they never lasted long enough to be more than a footnote in the ages. Here's another one that takes hearty inspirations from our Mexican neighbors. Enchiladas casseroles were the talk of the town when they first showed up. See some people randomly combining foods that work just fine. Solo are not mad scientists. They are real visionaries, and there is a tunnel with a light at the end only they can see. In this case, the luminescence came from the light bulb that went off in people's heads when they thought two things. Why not use layered tortillas with enchiladas and other vegetables? Kick it up a notch with a sauce that actually worked in casseroles paired with cheesy meat, and you had a winner. Every winner must let go of their championship belt someday, and these were no exception. Osobuko is something that's known for smoothness. The way the meat falls off of the bone, the saltiness of the gremolata, the freshness of that first bite, which is an experience that you have to savor all on its own. If you're like one of those people who loves to try out your local Italian-American cuisine, you'd be doing yourself one hell of an injustice by not ever trying this. The way this dish got popular was because while the dish was originally made only with veal, by the time it hit American soil, it was using substitutes like beef or pork shanks. This made the dish accessible for your everyday Joe who can't afford to spend a lot on vegetables because, bills. Plus, if you add some gremolata, which is a mix of lemon zest, garlic, and parsley, to the dish, then you get a pretty balanced set of flavors that bounce off of each other. This is one of the finest parts of Italian-American cuisine, and it got popular for being a wonderful family meal that can keep everyone content and full. Despite what you might think about chicken Kaciator, it's actually not hard at all. This was renowned as a one-pot meal, basically, the kind of thing you only need to pay minimal attention to. Italian-American cuisine is yet again the star of the show this time, and the interest in food like this was something America really only went through during the post-war period and towards the 70s and 80s. There was this growing national interest in foreign cuisines from the world over. I'm talking the deepest reaches of Mexico and Spain to Italian classics like this one, which you'd normally never even think to fight in an American home. However, dishes like these work so well with the average American's palate that it's a wonder you don't see them. Chicken pieces that get browned and simmered with tomatoes, bell peppers, garlic, and sometimes even wine. Slow cooked until you get a rich, thick sauce and chicken that needs barely any seasoning because it's already oozing with flavor. Simple ingredients, a no-fuss cooking method, and a taste that works for every chicken fan. It's not hard to see how this dish got to where it is, and now, chicken Kaciator is something you regularly find at almost any meat-based restaurant. Way to come from humble beginnings, right? So if you've been following along until now, you can clearly see there's this big pattern with red meat and stews in the crockpot world. It seems like a lot of dishes tend to gravitate towards this format, so why is that? Things like bœuf bourguignon, otherwise known as a beef brisket, aren't any different. You get a traditional beef chuck that gets slow cooked in red wine, beef broth, onions, and herbs, and you wait until the meat is so soft you barely even need teeth to pull it apart. This dish was one of the highlights of French cooking, which was normally associated with luxury dining but got modified for the everyday home, and I gotta say, I'm so glad somebody came along and did that modifying. I wouldn't know how to act without my weekly fix of beef briskets, especially with how well they make mushrooms stand out. A dish that works well with mushrooms is one you have to hold close to your heart, always. Nothing says an everyday meal like some soup, and nothing helps something survive being an everyday meal like having some ham in it. Eggplant Parmesan casserole is another Italian classic that became a favorite in the United States. Eggplant was often a challenge to serve to picky eaters, so Grandma got creative and found a way to sneak it into delicious dishes, which resulted in the creation of this hearty dish. In Italy, it's better known as Parmigiana and is a popular gourmet dish. The casserole is a more laid-back version of the delicacy, as you can enjoy the flavors of this classic Italian dish without all the work of frying each individual slice of eggplant. Don't get me wrong, Gram loved making us those labor-intensive meals, but even she deserved a break sometimes. And this casserole gave her the perfect opportunity to whip up something delicious without spending hours in the kitchen. The turkey noodle casserole wasn't the only way of using up leftover turkey from the fridge. Turkey tetrazzini was another delicious dish you could make the morning after Thanksgiving. This casserole typically started out with a base of spaghetti, along with a creamy sauce that's usually made from a combination of broth, cream, and sometimes cream of mushroom soup and vegetables like peas, carrots, or celery. It was named after the Italian opera singer Luisa Tetrazzini, who was known for her performances in the early 20th century. The dish is believed to have been created in the early 20th century, coinciding with Tetrazzini's rise to fame. Many recipes included cheese such as Parmesan or cheddar, which made it kid-friendly. This was another great example of how Graham could make something so delicious out of leftovers that might have otherwise gone to waste. Which one-pot favorite do you miss the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons to bring them back.